clock and the hum of traffic outside. Elias looked exhausted. His clothes were rumpled, and he hadn't shaved. Without a word, he reached into his briefcase and placed a manila envelope on the polished mahogany desk, right next to Arthur's half-eaten turkey sandwich. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Inside was a cashier's check for $10,000. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Keep this in escrow, Elias told him, his voice trembling but deadly serious. When they find me dead, I don't want you to trust the police. I want you to use this money to hire a private investigator. You find out who did it. A is less than BR is greater than is less than. BR is greater than. Arthur just stared at him. He tried to reason with Elias. He asked him if he was sleeping, if he had seen a doctor recently. Because, from the outside, the explanation for all of this seemed tragically simple. The false explanation that everyone from the police to his neighbors to his own lawyer silently agreed upon. Elias Thorne, a 4-year-old divorced man living alone, was suffering from a severe, early-onset paranoid breakdown. His family had a history of dementia. The misplaced mouthwash, the thermostat, the paranoia, it all fit the clinical profile of a mind turning against itself. Arthur took the check, but purely to humor him, hoping it would give Elias some peace of mind. At least, not yet knowing how wrong he was. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Arthur assumed the crisis had passed. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Then came September 9th. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. It was an unusually hot Monday. Elias's next-door neighbor noticed that Elias's mail had been spilling out of the roadside mailbox since Thursday. His car was still in the driveway. The neighbor walked over, knocked on the door, and noticed a strange metallic smell lingering near the garage. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The police arrived at 2:15 p.m. They found Elias Thorne dead in the front seat of his sedan, parked inside his closed garage. The keys were in the ignition. The gas tank was empty. The initial ruling was exactly what everyone expected: suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. A tragic, logical end to a man's rapid mental decline. It was a neat, tidy explanation that closed the case before it even opened. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The truth had seemingly collapsed into a sad, mundane statistic. Is less than BR is greater than BR. Is less than BR is greater than BR. Arthur felt a terrible wave of guilt. He sat in his office, looking at the check still sitting in his safe, wondering if he could have done more to get Elias psychiatric help. He prepared to transfer the funds back to Elias's modest estate. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. But 3 days later, the mail arrived. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Arthur's secretary dropped a small, padded yellow envelope on his desk. It was postmarked Wednesday, September 4th, the day before Elias supposedly drove his car into a closed garage and took his own life. Arthur opened it with a silver letter opener. Inside was a single cheap plastic flash drive and a handwritten note on a torn piece of legal paper. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The note said, Arthur, I don't know how to drive a manual transmission. Check the car. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Arthur froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He immediately picked up the phone and called the detective who had signed off on the scene. He asked one question. What kind of car was Elias found in? Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The detective shuffled through his notes. A 2008 Honda Civic, the detective replied. 5-speed stick shift, is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. In an instant, the tidy explanation of a tragic suicide shattered. The walls of Arthur's quiet office suddenly felt like they were closing in. Elias Thorne hadn't killed himself. He had been murdered, staged to look like a suicide, by someone who made one tiny critical mistake. They used Elias's project car, a car he had bought to restore but physically didn't know how to drive. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, and now Arthur had $10,000 to hunt a ghost. Now at this point, Arthur didn't call the police back right away. And honestly, I don't blame him. He just hung up the phone, locked his office door, and stared at that cheap plastic flash drive sitting on his desk. The hum of the building's air conditioning suddenly felt incredibly loud. It was 6 p.m. on a Friday. The cleaning staff was vacuuming somewhere down the hall, a completely mundane sound, while Arthur sat alone, realizing he was holding the digital remains of a man who had choreographed his own murder investigation. He poured himself a cup of stale, tepid coffee from the break room, more for the familiar routine of it than anything else, and sat back down. He plugged the drive into his laptop. There was no dramatic encryption, just a folder containing 2 PDF documents and 1 MP4 video file. Arthur clicked the PDFs first. They were bank statements from Elias's primary savings account. Highlighted in bright digital yellow were dozens of withdrawals over the last 8 months. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there, but escalating rapidly. They were checks written to cash. The signatures looked like Elias's, but they were a little too perfect. A total of $142,000 had been quietly siphoned away. Next to the statements was a scanned copy of a municipal property line agreement from 3 years prior. The signature on the agreement was a perfect, identical match to the forged checks. It belonged to Greg Miller, Elias's next-door neighbor. The same concerned neighbor who had found Elias's body and called the police. Arthur's stomach dropped. He clicked on the video file. It was timestamped Thursday, September 5th at 4:15 p.m., less than 24 hours before Greg supposedly found Elias dead. It was footage from a hidden camera, likely shoved inside a hollowed-out radio or a bookshelf in Elias's kitchen. And you have to understand, watching this footage, it wasn't a movie. There was no tense soundtrack, just the low mechanical drone of Elias's refrigerator and the grainy, washed-out lighting of a late afternoon. Elias was sitting at his kitchen table. He looked exhausted, pale. He was staring at the wall, just waiting. Then there's a knock on the back door. Greg walks in. He's wearing a gray fleece vest and holding a Tupperware container. "Brought you some of that stew, Eli," Greg says. His voice is perfectly friendly. Warm, even. He's the picture of a helpful suburban neighbor checking on the crazy old man next door. They talk for a few minutes about the weather, about the yard. It is sickeningly normal. Then Greg offers to make them both some instant coffee. Elias nods. When Elias turns his head to cough, Greg casually reaches into his fleece vest, pulls out a small prescription bottle, and dumps a heavy dose of crushed powder into Elias's mug. He stirs it with a spoon, taps the spoon on the rim times clink, clink times, and sets it down in front of Elias. Arthur found himself holding his breath, leaning closer to the monitor. Elias looks down at the mug. He sits there, in silence, for a long time. And this is the part that would haunt Arthur for the rest of his life. Because looking at the footage, you can see it in Elias's eyes. He times knows. He knows exactly what is in that cup. He knows Greg has been stealing from him. He knows Greg has been gaslighting him, moving his keys, making him look insane to the rest of the world so no one would believe him when the money went missing. Elias looks up from the mug, and for just a fraction of a second, he makes dead eye contact with the hidden camera lens across the room. Then, he picks up the coffee, and he drinks it. Within 20 minutes, Elias slumps forward onto the table, completely unconscious. The heavy, dead weight of his body makes the wood creak. Greg doesn't panic. He doesn't cackle or act like a mastermind. He just finishes his own coffee, takes his mug to the sink, washes it, dries it with a towel, and puts it in the cabinet. Then he puts on a pair of leather gardening gloves, hooks his arms under Elias's armpits, and drags him out the door toward the garage. His rubber soles squeak slightly on the linoleum. And that was it. The video ended. Arthur sat in the dark. The truth of the reconstruction collapsed over him like a ton of bricks. Greg dragged Elias out to the garage to stage a suicide. He saw the Honda Civic, put Elias in the driver's seat, turned the key, and closed the garage door. Carbon monoxide would take care of the rest. It was a tidy, tragic end that the police bought without a second thought. But Greg made a mistake. He didn't know Elias's left knee had been completely shattered in a workplace accident decades ago. Elias physically could not press a clutch pedal. He hadn't been able to drive a manual transmission in 30 years. Greg just saw a car and used it, unknowingly sealing his own fate with a 2,000-pound mechanical alibi. Arthur called the police. The detective drove over that night to collect the flash drive. The emotional aftermath of the case was remarkably quiet. There was no grand shootout. When the police went to arrest Greg Miller on Saturday morning, he was standing in his driveway in his slippers, taking out the recycling. He looked confused, then resigned. Just a greedy, mundane man who realized he'd been outsmarted by the ghost he had created. For weeks, Arthur felt a profound, lingering sadness. Elias wasn't paranoid. He was a man drowning in plain sight, forced to fund his own post-mortem investigation because the world had already written him off as crazy. But the final aftershock, the detail that kept Arthur awake at night, came 2 months later while he was finalizing the paperwork for Elias's estate. Arthur was looking at the original $10,000 cashier's check Elias had given him. He noted the issue date, August 1st. Just to be thorough, Arthur cross-referenced it with the DMV title records for the 2008 Honda Civic sitting in Elias's garage. Elias had purchased the car on August 2nd for exactly $1,200. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He sat back in his chair as the true timeline clicked into place. Elias hadn't just bought a project car by accident. He had purposefully bought a manual transmission car a full month in advance. He parked it in his garage and deliberately let the gas tank run near empty so it wouldn't run long enough to destroy the physical evidence inside the cabin. The $10,000 wasn't just to hire Arthur. It was a psychological anchor. Elias knew that if he paid a lawyer $10,000, the lawyer would feel obligated enough to actually look at the case file when he died. Elias Thorne hadn't just predicted his own murder. He had meticulously engineered the crime scene, bought his own coffin, left the keys in the ignition, and sat at his kitchen table, patiently waiting for his neighbor to put him inside. The unsweating man. The cold open is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. On the sweltering afternoon of July 18th, paramedics in Southern California responded to a chaotic 911 call near mile 18 of an elite marathon qualifier. When they arrived, they found a 8-year-old man collapsed on the melting asphalt. The man was an Olympic hopeful, someone in peak physical condition, but as the medics rushed over and touched his skin, they physically recoiled. He was radiating heat like a cast iron stove. A medic quickly took his core temperature. It was 107.8 degrees Fahrenheit. His organs were actively shutting down. But there was one detail that completely baffled the first responders. It was 98 degrees outside. The man had just run 18 miles at a blistering pace, yet his skin was bone dry. There was not a single drop of sweat on him. He wasn't just having a severe heat stroke, he was somehow hermetically sealed, cooking from the inside out. And the terrifying truth is, the thing that was killing him wasn't the brutal weather. It was his own meticulous preparation. It was a fatal mistake he had made in his own bathroom just 3 hours earlier. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. The call to action is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. But before we get into the deeply disturbing details of this case, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in a grounded documentary style, please kindly invite the like button over to help you paint your living room, but when they arrive, hand them a single toothbrush and tell them to start on the baseboards. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. The normal world. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. Elias Vance was what you would call a total pro. At 28, he had spent the last decade of his life optimizing every single variable of his existence for one singular purpose: long-distance running. And honestly, Elias wasn't just disciplined, he was obsessive. If you walked into his sparse one-bedroom apartment, you wouldn't see much in the way of decoration. Instead, you'd see biometric spreadsheets taped to the drywall, expensive heart rate monitors charging on the kitchen counter right next to an open bag of stale coffee grounds, and a perfectly aligned row of running shoes squeaking against the linoleum. He was the kind of guy who would literally weigh his socks to make sure they weren't carrying extra moisture. Now, at this point in his career, Elias was on the absolute cusp of qualifying for the Olympic team. But to secure his spot, he had to dominate a highly publicized qualifying race in the high desert. He knew the heat was going to be the great equalizer. The human body can only take so much ambient temperature before biological functions begin to fail, so Elias spent weeks meticulously researching heat management. And this obsessive trait, which had brought him so much success, is exactly what set the stage for his downfall. At the time, his girlfriend Sarah thought his intense preparation was just business as usual. He was spending late nights on deep web athletic forums, reading up on experimental gear and marginal gains. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just Elias being Elias. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The first disturbance is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. About a week before the race, the mailman dropped off a nondescript, heavy cardboard box on Elias's porch. It was from a boutique sports science laboratory that Elias had privately reached out to. Inside was a large, unmarked jar containing a prototype thermal barrier gel. The marketing packet claimed it was a revolutionary liquid skin, a microscopic polymer that you slather all over your body to completely block UV radiation, insulate against external ambient heat, and eliminate 100% of friction and chafing. Elias opened the jar. It had a strange, sterile smell, almost like industrial caulk, mixed with cheap sunscreen. He scooped a small amount onto his fingertips and rubbed it onto his forearm. Almost immediately, the gel hardened into an invisible, slightly glossy shell. He stood there, in his bathroom, just staring at it. It felt weirdly tight. When he ran his arm under the tap, the water didn't just bead up, it physically repelled off his skin, leaving it perfectly dry. Elias hesitated for a second. The tightness felt unnatural, almost suffocating on his arm. He flexed his wrist, feeling the artificial resistance. But he quickly rationalized it away. He figured the tightness just meant the seal was working. He was a professional. He was entirely used to physical discomfort. He wiped down the counter, left the jar right next to his toothbrush, and went to bed. At the time, this didn't seem strange, which actually mattered later because he had no way of knowing that this simple jar of experimental ointment was effectively a biological straitjacket. The morning of the race arrived. The air in the starting parking lot was already thick, stagnant, and oppressive. You could hear the distant, hollow clunking of porta-potty doors and the nervous, hushed chatter of runners adjusting their bib numbers. In the back of his rented SUV, away from the crowds, Elias stripped down. He opened the jar of the prototype gel, and because he was a man who believed in absolute, total optimization, he didn't just apply a thin layer to his legs. He spent 20 minutes methodically slathering the thick, unyielding polymer over every single inch of his body, his legs, his chest, his back, his neck. He completely sealed himself in. Suspense, escalation, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. The starting gun went off. And honestly, for the first 10 miles, Elias felt invincible. The pacing was perfect, his breathing was steady, and the ambient temperature was already climbing past 100 degrees. Around him, the other runners were visibly suffering. You could hear the heavy, rhythmic slapping of wet running shoes on the baking asphalt, see the dark, soaked patches on their shirts, and smell that sharp scent of hot tarmac and mass exertion. But Elias? Elias was completely dry. At first, he thought the gel was a miracle. The wind whipped past him, and the tight, invisible shell over his skin seemed to be doing exactly what the marketing packet promised, blocking the brutal external heat of the desert sun. He was cruising, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, but right around mile 14, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden dramatic wall of pain. It was just a slow, creeping heaviness. A strange, deep-seated warmth blooming in the center of his chest. He shook his arms out, trying to loosen up, but that tight, suffocating feeling he had noticed in the bathroom the night before was back. Only now, it was everywhere. His heart rate monitor beeped, a sharp digital warning cutting through the quiet desert air. His pulse was spiking to 185 beats per minute, way too high for this stage of the race. He slowed his pace slightly, taking deep, gasping breaths, but the air felt thin, and the heat radiating from his own torso was becoming unbearable. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, false explanation, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. At this point, you have to understand the mindset of an elite athlete. They are trained to rationalize physical agony. Elias didn't immediately panic or think about the experimental gel. He just figured he was hitting the proverbial wall early. It was 105 degrees outside after all. He assumed it was classic textbook dehydration. His brain told him that he had miscalculated his fluid intake and that the arid desert air was just wicking the sweat off his body faster than he could feel it. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than, BR is greater than. About a mile later, he saw the white canopy of an official medical and hydration tent shimmering in the heat haze. The setup was totally mundane, just folding tables, sticky puddles of spilled electrolyte drinks on the dirt, a few exhausted volunteers holding out paper cups, and a giant cooler of ice water. Elias stumbled toward it. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, a telltale sign of heat exhaustion. A medical volunteer asked if he wanted to sit down, noting how violently flushed his face was. Elias waved her off. He just needed to cool down his core temperature. He grabbed a massive, soaking wet sponge from one of the ice buckets, tilted his head back, and squeezed the freezing water directly over his head, neck, and chest. He waited for that immediate, shocking relief of cold water hitting overheated skin. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, collapse of truth, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, but the relief never came. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. And here is where the truth actually started to break through. When Elias squeezed the sponge, the water didn't soak into his skin. It didn't spread, and it didn't evaporate. It literally hit the invisible polymer shell, beat it up like rain on a freshly waxed car, and rolled right off into the dirt. Elias stood there, his chest heaving, staring blankly at the wet spots on the dry desert ground. He dropped the sponge and reached a trembling hand up to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, but there was no sweat. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. He dragged his fingers hard across his cheek, then his neck, then his chest. His skin was bone dry. In fact, it was glossy, tightly sealed, and incredibly hot to the touch, like touching the metal door of a baking oven. The horrifying realization hit him all at once, shattering the dehydration theory. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. He wasn't dehydrated. His hydration pack was still half full. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. The human body survives extreme heat through a very specific biological function, evaporation. We sweat, the moisture hits the air, and it cools our blood, which in turn cools our internal organs. It's the only way we don't literally boil alive. Elias hadn't stopped sweating because he was out of fluids. He had stopped sweating because the liquid skin he had meticulously painted over every inch of his body was absolutely impermeable. He had physically glued his own pores shut. For the last 2 hours, running under a blistering sun, His body had been desperately trying to vent heat, but it couldn't. He had effectively wrapped himself in microscopic cling wrap. He wasn't just overheating from the desert sun, he was trapped inside a sealed biological pressure cooker, and he was cooking himself from the inside out. The reveal, the twist, and honestly, trying to imagine the sheer claustrophobic terror Elias must have felt in that specific moment is almost impossible. He stood there at the edge of the hydration station, staring down at his arms. He started dragging his fingernails across his forearms, digging in hard, trying to scratch off the invisible layer of polymer. But his nails just slid uselessly over the smooth synthetic barrier. He was panting heavily now, taking short, shallow gasps. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly entirely devoid of strength, and collapsed hard into the dry dirt, kicking up a small cloud of dust. At first, the medical volunteers, mostly off-duty nurses and local college kids, didn't panic. They had seen heat exhaustion 100 times. A couple of them jogged over, grabbed him by the armpits, and dragged him into the shade of the main medical tent. It was a chaotic, thoroughly mundane scene inside. The smell of dusty canvas, spilled iodine, and stale coffee. A radio crackled in the background with boring race updates. The lead medic, an older guy who was casually chewing on a pen cap, ordered the standard protocol. Get him on the cot. Pack his neck, armpits, and groin with ice. Let's get an IV going. Now at this point, they fully expected him to stabilize. But when a young nurse went to insert the IV needle into the crook of Elias's arm, the needle literally slipped sideways. She frowned, apologizing, thinking she had just misjudged the angle. She wiped the area with an alcohol swab, but the alcohol just beat it up and rolled off onto the squeaky vinyl cot. She tried again, and she had to use a disturbing amount of physical force just to puncture the microscopic hardened shell covering his skin. While she struggled with the IV, the lead medic checked Elias's core temperature using a tympanic ear thermometer. The thermometer beeped. It read 106.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The medic stared at the screen, second-guessing the equipment. He swapped the thermometer for a backup and checked again. 107.4 degrees. At this temperature, the proteins in the human brain literally begin to denature. It is a fatal threshold. The medic dropped the thermometer and placed his bare hand flat against Elias's chest to check for a pulse. He froze. Elias was radiating an unnatural burning heat, but his skin was completely impossibly dry. It felt like touching the hood of a car that had been sitting in a sweltering parking lot all day. "Why isn't he sweating?" the medic muttered, confusion rapidly giving way to outright panic. "He feels like plastic." Emotional aftermath. Before we get to the devastating conclusion of Elias's fatal mistake, if you want to support the channel, please offer to help the like button paint their living room, but secretly mix a heavy dose of industrial superglue into the primer so they can never, ever change the color. Thanks. The medical tent devolved into absolute, terrifying chaos. The casual atmosphere shattered. Medics were screaming for a medevac helicopter. They began frantically pouring entire coolers of ice water over Elias, hoping to force his core temperature down. But because the water couldn't make contact with his actual skin, the heat couldn't transfer efficiently. He was perfectly insulated. The ice just slid off him into the dirt. By the time Elias's support crew arrived at the tent, out of breath and holding the empty canister of the liquid skin spray, Elias was seizing violently. When the crew chief stammered out what Elias had done, how he had painted himself in an aerospace-grade urethane sealant to reduce wind resistance, the medics were paralyzed. There was no medical protocol for this. You can't just peel off a microscopic chemical bond. They actually grabbed rough surgical scrub brushes, desperately trying to scrape the sealant off his chest and stomach so his body could breathe. But the polymer had been engineered specifically to withstand extreme friction. It held fast. The sound of the medevac helicopter drowned out the shouting in the tent as Elias was loaded onto a stretcher. His crew stood helpless in the blowing dust, watching the aircraft lift off, a heavy, sinking realization settling over them. Final aftershock, Despite the doctors at the hospital eventually using heavy chemical solvents to break down the barrier, it was too late. The prolonged exposure to an internal temperature of over 107 degrees had caused catastrophic multi-organ failure. Elias slipped into a coma from which he would never wake up. Later, when investigators reviewed the physical evidence from the race, they found the empty aerosol can of the experimental aerodynamic spray discarded in the team's trash bin. Elias had spent his entire life obsessing over how to push his body to the absolute limit. He wanted to cheat the wind. He wanted to become a perfectly frictionless object. And in the end, he succeeded. But printed right there on the back of the sleek silver canister, in incredibly small, mundane black text, was a warning label that Elias had either ignored or simply arrogantly believed his Olympic endurance could outlast. Warning: for use on carbon fiber equipment only. Highly impermeable. Under absolutely no circumstances should this product be applied to human skin. Blood in the concrete, the hit that wasn't. Cold open hook. It was raining. Not a dramatic thunderstorm, just that miserable, freezing November drizzle that coats everything in a thin layer of ice and makes the streetlights look hazy. The person sitting in the idling lease sedan didn't seem to mind. They had been parked in the shadows of the gravel lot for almost 2 hours, staring at a single lit window in a corrugated steel office building. Around 8:15 p.m., the office light clicked off. A man walked out. You could hear his keys jingling in the quiet night as he pulled his heavy jacket collar up against the wind, head down, making a beeline for his pickup truck. The person in the sedan stepped out. They didn't run. They didn't rush. They walked calmly up behind the man, raised a 9mm pistol, and fired 2 shots directly into the back of his head. The sound was muffled by the rain. The man dropped instantly onto the wet gravel. The shooter stood there for a second, looking down. Then they simply turned, walked back to their car, put it in drive, and rolled away into the dark. And honestly, the whole thing was so clean, so surgical, and so completely devoid of any messy emotion that when detectives finally arrived and taped off the lot, they took one look at the body and immediately came to a very specific conclusion. They thought, this is a professional hit. This is the mafia. But they were wrong. The truth of what happened that night was a lot closer to home, far more amateurish, and incredibly tragic. Normal world setup. To understand how completely the police misread the situation, you have to understand the victim. His name was Arthur Penhaligon, though everybody just called him Artie. Artie didn't run an underground gambling ring. He didn't owe money to the mob. He ran Penhaligon Commercial Paving. He was 56 years old, and his life was, frankly, exhausting. He was the kind of guy who woke up every single morning at 4 a.m. without an alarm clock. His routine was always the same. 2 cups of cheap, stale drip coffee out of a scratch thermos, sitting in the dark kitchen for 20 minutes, just trying to gather the energy to face the day. He was a guy with dirt permanently wedged under his fingernails and a bad lower back. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Brenda, for over 30 years. They lived in a normal, slightly cluttered suburban house with a golden retriever and a stack of junk mail on the kitchen counter that they always meant to sort through but never actually did. Artie wasn't a gangster. He was a small business owner stressed out about rising diesel costs, supply chain delays, and making sure his 12 employees got their paychecks on Friday. He was totally ordinary. And at the time, nobody in his life, not his wife, not his kids, not his friends, thought he was in any kind of danger. Why would they? Life was just life. First disturbance. But looking back, there were signs. Tiny, weird anomalies that didn't make sense until long after the yellow police tape was rolled up. Now at this point, you have to put yourself in Artie's shoes to understand why he didn't run. It was late October, about 3 weeks before the murder. Artie was working late in the dispatch trailer. It was a Tuesday evening, and the yard was mostly empty. Around 7 p.m., he heard the heavy crunch of tires on the gravel outside. He looked out the frosted, dirty window of his office and saw a dark blue sedan sitting at the very edge of the lot near the chain-link gate. The headlights were off, but the engine was running. He could see the thick white exhaust pluming in the cold air. Artie didn't panic. He actually just sat there in his desk chair, holding a stack of invoices, and watched it. People used his lot to turn around all the time. He watched the car for a minute, maybe a minute and a half. The car just sat there, idling in the dark. Someone inside was watching the trailer. Then, very slowly, it backed out onto the street and drove away. Artie actually mentioned it to his foreman, a guy named Dave, the very next morning. It was just a passing comment over coffee. "Hey, some weirdo was parked out by the gate last night." Dave asked if he got a plate number. Artie said no, which actually mattered later, because that plate could have blown the whole case wide open. But at the time, they both just laughed it off. They figured it was teenagers looking for a place to drink, or a lost delivery driver. You see, when you live a normal life, you don't immediately jump to the conclusion that someone is hunting you. You rationalize it. You downplay it. You just go back to worrying about the concrete pour scheduled for noon. But then, the silent phone calls started at the house. Just dead air when Brenda picked up the receiver. And slowly, a quiet, creeping feeling that something was very wrong began to bleed into Artie's ordinary world. And honestly, you can only ignore those silent phone calls for so long before it starts to wear on you. By early November, the air was getting colder, and that creeping dread was becoming a permanent fixture in Artie's life. He started doing little things, subtle things that showed he was spooked, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. He'd wait in his truck with the doors locked until his employees showed up in the morning. He started double-checking the deadbolt at home, lingering by the front window, just staring out at the quiet suburban street, listening to the wind rattle the bare oak branches. Brenda noticed, of course. You don't sleep next to someone for 20 years and not feel when their heart is racing. But when she asked him what was wrong, Artie just blamed it on the stress of a new municipal parking garage contract. He downplayed it. It was that imperfect, human denial. He didn't want to scare her. And then came Thursday, November 14th, the day the normal world completely shattered. Artie usually walked through the front door at 6:15 p.m., right when the local news was starting. By 7:30, Brenda was pacing the kitchen. She tried his cell straight to voicemail. She called the office, ringing, dead air. At 8:15 p.m., she called Dave, the foreman. Dave lived about 10 minutes from the yard. He drove over in his sweatpants, annoyed but figuring Artie just fell asleep at his desk or his truck battery died. Dave pulled into the gravel lot. The heavy equipment was silent, casting long, monstrous shadows under the single, flickering sodium street lamp. The door to the dispatch trailer was slightly ajar. Dave walked up the wooden steps, pushing the door open, the hinges whining in the cold air. And what he saw in that cramped, fluorescent-lit office is something he would never be able to unsee. Artie was slumped over his metal desk, surrounded by scattered invoices and a massive, dark pool of blood soaking into the cheap carpet. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. It was brutal, efficient, and cold. When the police arrived, they taped off the lot, set up the blinding halogen work lights, and the rumor mill immediately started churning. Now at this point, you have to look at the environment. It's the Northeast. It's the concrete business. It's municipal contracts. The detectives walked into that trailer, saw an unrobbed cash box, untouched expensive equipment, and an execution-style double tap to the back of the head. It looked like a professional hit. A textbook mafia assassination. And honestly, it made total sense. The police dove headfirst into this theory. They spent weeks drinking stale coffee in idling unmarked cars outside known mob hangouts. They pulled all of Artie's business records, looking for the smoking gun. Did he owe a loan shark? Was he being extorted by union bosses? They found out Artie had recently underbid a rival concrete company for that big city parking garage project, a company whose owner had known ties to organized crime families in the area. It was the perfect narrative. It gave the chaos a shape, a logical, cinematic reason for existing. The local papers ran with it. The family was horrified, wondering if the man they loved had a secret, dark life. But the truth is, real life is rarely like the movies. And this perfectly logical explanation was about to completely collapse under the weight of sloppy, messy reality. The first crack in the mafia theory came from the financial forensic accountants. They went through every ledger, every W-2, every bank deposit, and found absolutely nothing. Artie was boringly clean. He paid his taxes, he didn't gamble, he had no hidden debts. Then, the physical evidence started contradicting the narrative. The ballistics report finally came back from the state lab. The murder weapon wasn't a professional hitman's suppressed 9mm or a clean .22 caliber pistol. The killer used a 1.6 gauge shotgun loaded with birdshot. It was a chaotic, sloppy weapon that caused a wide spray effect with little pellets. No professional assassin uses birdshot to make a clean hit. It's far too unpredictable. And then there was the footprint. Near the base of the desk, perfectly preserved in a puddle of spilled dried coffee, was a single partial shoe print. The detectives measured it. It was a size 8. Small. Narrow. Far too small to belong to the hulking mob enforcers they had been tailing for 3 weeks. As Detective Miller sat in his cluttered cubicle staring at that photo of the size 8 footprint, the sickening realization washed over him. This wasn't a professional hit ordered by a mafia boss. The whole organized crime angle was a massive, time-wasting red herring. They were looking for a ghost in a tailored suit, but the real killer was someone entirely different. Someone messy. Someone much, much closer to home. And honestly, when you have to pivot a murder investigation from an organized mob hit to someone inside the victim's inner circle, it is an ugly, deeply uncomfortable transition. The detectives didn't want to believe it. It's much easier to blame a faceless syndicate than to look at a grieving family and wonder which one of them pulled the trigger. At first, they quietly worked their way through the outer rings of Artie's life. They spent a week looking into a cousin who had a minor drug charge in the 90s. A dead end. Then they looked at a neighbor who had complained about the noise from Artie's work trucks. Another dead end. The whole time they were stuck on that 1.6 gauge shotgun and that size 8 shoe. Now, at this point, Detective Miller was exhausted. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and he drove out to Artie's house to update the widow, Elaine, on the case. He walked into the kitchen, and the house smelled like pine sol and stale coffee, that distinct, heavy scent of a home where someone has recently died and people are just desperately trying to keep busy. Elaine was sitting at the kitchen island, looking hollowed out, wearing a faded, oversized sweater. Sitting across from her was Artie's two-year-old son, Justin. Justin was a quiet kid, always a little small for his age, struggling to find his footing in the world. He was the one who had initially found the body, the one who had made that hysterical 911 call. Miller sat down at the table, wrapped his hands around a cheap ceramic mug of coffee Elaine had poured him, and just let the silence hang for a moment. He looked across the table at Justin. Justin was staring at the floor, bouncing his leg nervously. And that's when Miller's eyes fell on Justin's feet. He was wearing a pair of worn-out work boots. Small. Narrow. Size 8. Miller's stomach gave a slow, sickening lurch. But lots of guys wear size 8, right? He tried to brush it off, second-guessing himself. He looked away from Justin's feet and scanned the kitchen island. Right in the middle of the counter was a massive, chaotic stack of condolence cards. Hundreds of them. Neighbors, friends, rival concrete companies, all sending their sympathies. Elaine had been meticulously opening them and storing them in a sturdy green and yellow cardboard box to keep them organized. Now, if you've ever been in a grieving house, you know people use whatever they can find to store things. Tupperware, shoe boxes, whatever is handy. Early on in the investigation, Miller had seen that box and thought absolutely nothing of it. It was just a family trying to manage their grief. But today, with the ballistics report burned into his brain, Though actually looked at the faded, peeling label on the side of that green and yellow box. His breath hitched in his chest. It was a vintage Remington box. 1.6 gauge. Birdshot. the exact, highly specific ammunition used to execute Artie. The breathing room in that kitchen suddenly vanished. The air felt suffocatingly thick. Miller looked from the box of shotgun shells to Justin's size 8 boots, and the entire, terrifying truth collapsed into place. This wasn't a professional hitman. It was a terrified, desperate kid. Police later reconstructed exactly what happened, and it was devastatingly sloppy. Justin had quietly racked up a massive underground sports gambling debt. Not to the mafia, just to local bookies. He was drowning. Artie had found out and threatened to cut him off entirely to let him face the consequences. And so, Justin panicked. On the night of the murder, Justin didn't walk into the office with the cold precision of a mob enforcer. He walked in trembling. He took his grandfather's old bird-hunting shotgun from the back of the garage. The air must have burned his lungs as he stood behind his father. He hesitated. His hands shook so badly, he almost dropped the weapon. When he finally pulled the trigger, the 1.6, Gage kicked back fiercely, bruising his shoulder. It wasn't a clean, surgical strike. It was a chaotic, messy blast of birdshot. Then, in a blind panic, Justin tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but realized he hadn't taken the cash box. He tried to make it look like a hit, stepping in the spilled coffee by the desk, leaving that single damning footprint. The emotional aftermath of this realization fractured the family beyond repair. When Miller gently asked Elaine to step out of the kitchen, she already knew. You could see the horror wash over her face as she looked at her son. She didn't scream. She just let out this low, guttural sob and collapsed into a kitchen chair, watching the detectives handcuff the boy she had raised for murdering the man she had loved. It was an unbearable, quiet tragedy. There were no cinematic monologues, just a kid crying silently as he was led out the front door. But the final, most haunting detail, the thing that stayed with Detective Miller for the rest of his career, happened an hour later when evidence technicians were bagging up that Remington box. They had to empty out all the heartfelt condolence cards first. They removed letters from sobbing relatives, notes of sympathy from old friends, prayers for peace. And there, at the very bottom of the box, buried beneath a literal mountain of the town's grief and sympathy, was the original, crumpled paper receipt for the birdshot. Justin hadn't even thrown it away. He had just buried his guilt under the sympathy of strangers, hoping no one would ever look close enough to see the monster hiding in plain sight. The Blackwood Stew. Have you ever eaten something so incredibly good that your brain just shuts off? Like a meal so rich and savory that you stop caring about what's actually in it? But then, maybe hours later, you get this creeping, sinking feeling in your gut. Your body knows something your brain hasn't figured out yet. It knows you consumed something you really shouldn't have. Before we dive into the small town of Blackwood and their legendary secret ingredient, do me a quick favor. Take the like button, lock it in a walk-in freezer with a questionable slab of mystery meat, and leave it there until it completely freezes over, then shatter it into a million pieces. It really helps out the channel. All right, so let me paint a picture for you. Blackwood is one of those dreary, forgotten towns tucked away in the dampest part of the Pacific Northwest. The kind of place where the sky is always the color of wet concrete, and the local economy runs almost entirely on nostalgia and logging money that dried up 30 years ago. If you drive through on Route 9, the only reason you stop is for gas, or for times the Copper Kettle. The Copper Kettle was an institution. It was a classic, slightly run-down diner with squeaky red vinyl booths, faded linoleum floors, and a permanent smell of stale coffee and fried onions baked into the walls. Their claim to fame was the Heritage Stew. People drove for hundreds of miles just to try it. It was thick, dark, aggressively savory, and the meat was so tender it just melted on your tongue. Enter Elias Vance. Elias was a county health inspector. And honestly, Elias was just a regular, tired guy. He was 34, drinking lukewarm gas station coffee out of a dented thermos, and his dashboard was always buried under a mountain of junk mail, empty wrappers, and yellow carbon copy inspection forms. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy whose job was to make sure restaurants kept their chicken at the right temperature and didn't have rat droppings in the flour bins. Now at this point, Elias had inspected the copper kettle maybe half a dozen times over the last 4 years. And despite the diner's rugged, dated appearance, the owner, a sweet, soft-spoken woman in her 60s named Martha, ran a notoriously tight ship. The kitchens were always spotless. The grease traps were always emptied. Elias actually looked forward to these inspections because Martha always sent him home with a heavy steaming quart of heritage stew. It was a Tuesday morning, mid-November. The rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the tin roof of the diner. Elias was doing a routine B-grade follow-up. Nothing major. He had his clipboard out, checking off the usual boxes. He walked through the swinging metal doors into the back kitchen. Martha was there, humming to herself, wiping down a massive stainless steel prep table. Elias went through the motions. He checked the walk-in freezer. Everything was properly labeled. He checked the dry storage. No signs of pests. He was just about to sign the clearance sheet, thank Martha, and head back out into the rain. But then, he noticed something. It was such a minor, stupid detail. Down at the far end of the kitchen, near the back loading dock door, there was a heavy-duty plastic waste bin. Elias had checked it a million times before. It was usually where they threw away the bulky commercial packaging, cardboard boxes, giant plastic wrap rolls. But today, the bin was full of heavy burlap sacks. And honestly, at first, Elias didn't think much of it. Farms use burlap. It's totally normal. But as he stepped closer to check the latch on the back door, he caught a smell coming from the bags. It wasn't a food smell. It was earthy, like wet potting soil mixed with a very faint, sharp metallic tang, like old pennies or dried blood. And underneath that, a harsh chemical sting that immediately made the back of his throat itch. It smelled remarkably like industrial lye. Elias stood there for a second. He looked down at the burlap. The bags were completely blank. No farm logos, no shipping labels, no produce stamps. Just dark, stained, heavy fabric. He turned around. Martha was standing about 10 feet away. She had stopped humming. She was just holding her rag, watching him. There was this heavy, awkward silence in the kitchen. The only sound was the rain hitting the exhaust vents above them. Elias cleared his throat, suddenly feeling intensely self-conscious. You have to remember, he's just a guy doing a boring job. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want to accuse this sweet older woman of anything weird. "Hey, Martha," Elias said, pointing his pen at the bin. "New produce supplier? Don't think I've seen these bags before." Martha stared at him for just a fraction of a second too long. It was one of those micro-hesitations. Her eyes flicked from his face down to the burlap and then right back up. Then she smiled. A warm, perfectly natural smile. "Oh, those?" she said, her voice completely smooth. "Yes, dear. We found a new independent grower out past the county line for our root vegetables. Turnips and potatoes. They bring them in fresh from the dirt. Makes a world of difference for the stew." It was a perfectly logical explanation. It completely explained the earthy smell and the unmarked bags. Elias felt a brief wave of relief. Of course it was potatoes. What else would it be? He chided himself for being paranoid. "Gotcha," Elias said, signing the bottom of his form and tearing off the yellow copy for her. "Well, everything looks great as always, Martha." Martha thanked him, handed him his complimentary quart of hot stew in a plastic deli container, and waved goodbye. Elias got back into his car. He was soaked from the rain. He tossed his clipboard onto the passenger seat, cranked up the heat, and popped the lid off the stew. He was starving. He took a big bite. It was incredible, as always. Rich, hearty, melting in his mouth. But as he sat there, chewing, listening to the windshield wipers squeak back and forth across the glass, a slow, creeping realization started to form in the back of his mind. He had just checked Martha's walk-in freezer. He had checked the dry storage. He had looked at every single shelf in that kitchen. There wasn't a single potato or turnip in the entire building. And Elias suddenly realized he had absolutely no idea what he was chewing. Elias froze. The rhythmic squeaking thud of his windshield wipers suddenly sounded deafening in the small cabin of his sedan. He stopped chewing. The piece of meat in his mouth was perfectly tender, almost melting on his tongue, just like always. But right then, with the image of those blank, heavy burlap bags burning in his mind, the texture suddenly felt deeply, horribly wrong. He grabbed a napkin from the glove compartment and spat the mouthful into it. He sat there in the rainy parking lot for a long time, staring at the half-eaten container of stew, feeling a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Now, at this point, you or I might have called the police. But Elias was a mid-level county health inspector in a town where everyone knew everyone. He didn't want to be the guy who started a panic over a missing bag of potatoes. He rationalized it. He told himself Martha probably kept the root vegetables at her house, or maybe they were already peeled and mashed in some secondary prep cooler he'd simply overlooked. He really tried to let it go. And for about 2 weeks, he did. He went back to his mundane routine, logging health scores, drinking stale office coffee under buzzing fluorescent lights, ignoring the junk mail piling up on his desk. But then, the reports started coming in. It started small. A slight uptick in gastrointestinal issues filed at the local clinic, routine data entry for Elias's department. But over the next few days, the numbers climbed. People were coming into the urgent care with severe, unexplainable anemia, lethargy, and strange, raw sores at the back of their throats. And honestly, Elias wouldn't have even connected the dots, except for one tiny passing comment from a nurse he knew over the phone. She sounded exhausted. "I don't know what's going around," she said, "but half the Sunday lunch crowd from Martha's is in my waiting room right now." Elias felt all the blood leave his face. He hung up the phone and immediately pulled up the county agricultural database. He remembered Martha's perfectly calm excuse. A new independent grower out past the county line. He scoured the registries, scrolling past dozens of local orchards and dairy co-ops until he found it. Halloway Root Farms, located exactly where Martha had said. He pulled their recent EPA compliance filings. And suddenly, Elias felt this massive, overwhelming wave of relief. It wasn't a horror movie. It was just careless capitalism. According to the database, Halloway Farms had been heavily fined by the state 6 months prior for using an unapproved, highly caustic industrial fertilizer to break down hard soil, an illegal alkaline treatment. A chemical compound that, when mixed with water, smelled exactly like industrial lye. It all made perfect, terrifyingly logical sense. Martha was buying cheap, chemically tainted root vegetables from a disgraced farm to save a buck, and the caustic runoff was giving the town severe chemical food poisoning. It explained the blank bags. It explained the bleach smell. It explained the throat sores at the clinic. Elias exhaled a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 2 weeks. He was just dealing with a standard, albeit severe, health code violation. He printed out a stop sale order, grabbed his coat, and drove out past the county line to confront the farmer at Halloway Farms before he paid Martha a final visit. The drive took 40 minutes. The paved roads slowly turned to dirt, the houses grew further apart, and the gray, overcast sky made the open fields look desolate. When his GPS told him to turn right, Elias pulled down a long, overgrown gravel driveway, but he didn't find a bustling, rule-breaking farm. He found a rusted, heavy chain wrapped around a massive iron gate. Elias put his car in park and stepped out into the cold wind. The property was dead. The fields were totally overgrown with dry, brittle weeds. The tractor in the distance was a rusted husk, missing its wheels. Elias walked slowly up to the chain-link gate, his boots crunching loudly in the dead quiet. Pinned to the wood of the main barn, barely hanging on by a single rusted staple, was a bank foreclosure notice. The paper was yellowed and brittle, stained by years of rain. Elias leaned in closer to read the date. Halloway Farms had gone bankrupt and ceased all operations exactly 4 years ago. They hadn't grown a single turnip, potato, or root vegetable in almost half a decade. Elias stood there, alone in the wind, staring at the abandoned dirt. The false comfort of the fertilizer theory completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, bottomless dread. If Martha hadn't bought vegetables from this farm, then what the hell was in those heavy, unmarked bags? Elias drove back to town in absolute silence. And honestly, at this point, he was beyond confused. He was genuinely terrified. He didn't even turn on the car's heater, despite the freezing wind outside. He just gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles completely white, trying to process the massive hole in his theory. If Halloway Farms had been abandoned for 4 years, then Martha wasn't buying cheap, chemically tainted vegetables. So what the hell was in those heavy, unmarked canvas bags being dropped off in the alley? And then, by the time Elias pulled back into the town limits, it was well past 11 p.m. The streets were completely dead. He parked 2 blocks away from Martha's diner, cut the engine, and just sat there in the dark for a few minutes. He knew he didn't have enough evidence to call the police. Technically, all he had was a health code violation and a bad smell. But he also knew he couldn't just go home and sleep. He had to know what was in the basement. Then Elias walked through the misty, freezing rain, pulling his coat tight around his neck. He slipped down the narrow alley behind the diner. The neon open sign in the front window was off, and the building was pitch black. At the back of the building, set into the concrete, were the slanted wooden cellar doors that led down to the diner's storage basement. Elias knelt down. The doors were secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. But Elias, having inspected this building 3 times, knew Martha was creatures of habit. He reached up to the brick ledge just above the doorframe, felt around in the dark, and his fingers brushed against cold metal. The spare key. N. He unlocked the padlock, wincing at the loud, metallic clack times it made in the quiet alley. He pulled the heavy wooden doors open and slowly walked down the concrete steps into the basement. He didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the damp, freezing air. The basement smelled intensely of damp earth, old grease, and that same eye-watering scent of industrial bleach. And Elias panned the light around the room. Past the humming walk-in freezer, over by the floor drain, he saw them. 5 heavy, unmarked canvas bags. They were stacked haphazardly against the concrete wall. And as Elias stepped closer, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The bottoms of the bags were dark and damp, slowly seeping a thick, yellowish, soapy liquid toward the floor drain. N. Now, if you've ever worked around industrial chemicals, you know that lye does something very specific when it interacts with organic fat. It causes saponification. It literally turns fat into soap. Elias didn't know that at the time. All he knew was that his hands were shaking as he pulled a box cutter from his pocket. He knelt down next to the top bag, clicked the blade out, and sliced a long vertical line down the thick canvas. N. He grabbed the edges of the fabric and peeled them back. He shined his phone light inside, expecting to see mutated, rotting root vegetables. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. Inside the bag was a thick, gelatinous gray slurry. It looked like wet cement mixed with raw meat. The smell that hit him was so concentrated, so violently foul, a mix of ammonia, bleach, and sweet rotting flesh, that Elias actually stumbled backward and gagged. He covered his nose and mouth with his coat sleeve, his eyes watering profusely. And he forced himself to step back up to the bag. He leaned in, shining the light directly into the gray sludge. Something near the surface caught the light. It was a small, shiny piece of metal attached to a strip of bright blue plastic. Elias didn't want to touch it, but he had to know. He reached into his coat, pulled out a plastic pen, and used it to hook the blue strip. He slowly pulled it out of the gray, caustic paste. It was a blue nylon collar, and dangling from the metal D-ring was a bone-shaped aluminum tag. Elias wiped the thick, soapy grease off the tag with his thumb. In the dim light of his phone, he read the engraved word, Buster, N. The horrifying, unthinkable reality snapped into place all at once. Martha wasn't buying vegetables. She had made a quiet, under-the-table arrangement with the overwhelmed county animal shelter 2 towns over. They paid her in cash to dispose of euthanized strays and deceased pets. To get rid of the bodies quickly and quietly in her basement, she was soaking them in industrial lye, a highly caustic chemical that dissolves tissue and softens bone. But Martha was dangerously frugal. When meat prices started going up, she realized she had a basement full of chemically dissolved gelatinous protein. So, to stretch her meat supply and save money, she began mixing the caustic, lye-soaked slurry into the ground beef for her famous chili and thick, hearty stews. That's why the clinic was full of people with severe, unexplained chemical burns in their throats. They were eating industrial lye. Say, Ananias dropped the pen, scrambled up the basement stairs, and violently threw up in the alleyway. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely unlock his phone to dial 911. N. The aftermath tore the town apart. Within an hour, local police and a county hazmat team descended on the diner. Martha was arrested at her home in her nightgown. When the news broke, the emotional devastation in the community was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. It wasn't just the physical illness, it was the profound psychological trauma. Families who had lost pets, people who ate at the diner every single Sunday, they were lined up at the clinic, weeping, realizing exactly what they had been consuming for the past 8 months. But the absolute worst part? The detail that still keeps Elias awake at night? When the police interrogated Martha, she wasn't remorseful. She wasn't an evil, cackling villain. She sat in the interrogation room, genuinely bewildered by the outrage. She simply shrugged her shoulders and told the detectives, "Meat is meat. Times are tough. You have to use what you have." And sadly, she was right about one thing. When investigators interviewed the diner's most loyal regulars, the ones with the worst chemical burns in their mouths, many of them admitted with absolute shame that they had noticed a strange, soapy aftertaste in the stew for months. But they kept eating it anyway. Because the portions were huge, the price was cheap, and they just couldn't believe a sweet old lady would ever do them any harm. The vanity route. There is a specific, terrifying kind of disaster that only happens when someone desperately needs to be admired. On the morning of the 14th of January 2012, a man in a damp, badly wrinkled uniform sat alone in a sterile Italian police interrogation room. He was shivering, his hands tightly wrapped around a lukewarm cup of vending machine espresso. He wasn't a serial killer. He hadn't planned any violence. But in a matter of hours, his face would be plastered across international news, and he would be universally branded as the most hated man in all of Italy. But to understand how he ended up in that freezing room, staring blankly at the dregs of stale coffee, we have to rewind about 24 hours. The 13th of January 2012 began as a totally unremarkable day. The weather in Civitavecchia, a bustling coastal city near Rome, was a bit crisp, typical for the Mediterranean in the dead of winter. Over 4,000 people were in the process of checking into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar luxury resort. And honestly, calling it a resort almost feels like an understatement. It was more like a massive, self-contained city. It boasted 13 public levels, 4 swimming pools, a massive multi-tier theater, 5 high-end restaurants, and a sprawling casino. The man in charge of this entire operation, let's call him the director, was a 1-year-old named Francesco. Francesco was a man who took his position very, very seriously. He was deeply tanned, charismatic in a highly practiced sort of way, and notoriously obsessed with his image. In the early evening, as the thousands of guests were settling in, Francesco stood in his private quarters, meticulously adjusting the collar of his crisp, tailored uniform and checking his hair in the mirror. Now, at this point, you have to understand the culture of this specific type of high-end hospitality. Status is absolutely everything. The hierarchy is rigid, and the director is treated essentially like a king. Whatever he says, goes. No questions asked. By 7:30 p.m., the resort was in full swing. Guests were filtering into the grand dining rooms. If you walked through the main promenade, you would hear the muffled clinking of heavy silverware, the soft hum of live piano music, and smell roasted garlic and expensive wine. It was perfectly routine. Safe. Completely insulated from the outside world. But around 9 p.m., the first tiny crack in that routine occurred. Francesco was up in the main command center, the quiet, dimly lit nerve center of the entire operation, looking out into the pitch-black night. The resort was actually on the move, gliding smoothly through the dark waters toward its next destination. But Francesco suddenly got an idea. He had a retired colleague who lived on a tiny rocky island called Giglio, which happened to be somewhat along their general route. Francesco decided he wanted to show off. He ordered his staff to take this massive, multi-level, billion-dollar luxury complex and deviate from their deeply researched, computer-approved path. He wanted to steer it incredibly close to the shallow, rocky shoreline of the island just to blast the massive foghorns and do a theatrical salute for his old friend. At first, the junior staff in the command room hesitated. If you've ever been in a room with a demanding boss making a bad call, you know that exact feeling. You could almost feel that heavy, awkward silence where someone wants to speak up but bites their tongue instead. They nervously glanced at the charts. It was pitch black outside. The waters near that specific island were notoriously jagged. But he was the boss. And honestly, they had done similar flyby salutes before. It was a known, if officially frowned upon, tradition in their industry. So, clicking their mice and furiously typing on their consoles, they punched in the new coordinates. It was just a tiny adjustment. A few degrees off the safe path. At the time, this didn't seem dangerous at all. It didn't feel like the beginning of a nightmare. It just seemed like a boss flexing his authority to impress a buddy. Which actually mattered later, because nobody in that quiet, climate-controlled room realized they had just pointed a small city directly into a death trap. For the next 15 minutes, the atmosphere remained completely normal. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than down in the lowest levels of this massive floating complex. The dishwashers were sweating over sinks of scalding water, complaining about their shifts. Up in the Grand Theater, a magician was halfway through his routine, pulling a bright red silk scarf out of a hidden pocket. People were laughing. They were sipping espresso. It was a perfectly routine Tuesday night vibe, heavily insulated from the dark ocean outside, which is less than BR is greater than is less than, BR is greater than. Up in the command center, Francesco had taken manual control. It was completely pitch black out there. There was just the ambient glow of the radar screens reflecting off the panoramic glass. And honestly, this is where the arrogance really took over. He casually eyeballed the distance to the rocky shore, relying on his own sight rather than the highly advanced instruments. He ordered a sharp turn. But there was a slight language barrier in the room. The helmsman misinterpreted the direction. Francesco snapped at him, frantically correcting the order. But that tiny, human hesitation, just a few seconds of confusion in a quiet room was all it took. Is less than BR, is greater than. Is less than BR, is greater than. At 9:45 p.m., the floor did not just shake. It buckled. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. It wasn't a cinematic explosion. It sounded like an endless, deafening shriek of tearing metal. a deep, industrial groaning that reverberated through the very bones of everyone on board. Down in the dining halls, perfectly arranged tables suddenly lurched. Expensive bottles of wine shattered onto the marble floors. People were thrown from their velvet chairs. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than, BR, is greater than, and then, instantly, everything went completely black. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. For about 10 seconds, there was just dead, breathless silence in the dark. You can imagine the feeling. Your heart is pounding in your throat, but your brain is desperately trying to rationalize the horror. The emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie, dim yellow glow over the chaotic dining room. People were whispering, nervously helping each other up, off the floor. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, and then the intercom crackled. A calm, pre-recorded sounding voice echoed through the corridors. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience. We are experiencing a minor electrical failure with our main generators. Please remain calm and stay in your current areas. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than A minor. Electrical failure, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. And honestly, most people believed it at first. It made sense, right? The lights had gone out, the deep hum of the engines had clearly stopped, so it must just be a blown fuse in the basement. Some guests even started laughing nervously, joking with the waiters about getting a refund for their spilled drinks. The waitstaff, highly trained to keep up appearances at all costs, immediately started sweeping up the broken glass. The illusion of safety was still holding on by a thread. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Up in the command center, however, Francesco and his officers were frantically staring at their screens. They knew it wasn't a generator issue. They knew a 160-foot gash had just been ripped into the steel hull, and massive amounts of icy seawater were currently surging into the lower engine compartments. But instead of sounding the general alarm, Francesco doubled down on the lie. When the mainland Coast Guard called, alerted by confused guests using their cell phones, Francesco calmly assured them it was just a simple blackout. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But you cannot gaslight. Physics is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. By 10 p.m., the electrical failure story began to violently unravel. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. It started subtly. A guest sitting on the floor of the main lobby noticed that a stray piece of ice from a dropped cocktail wasn't just sitting there. It was slowly, steadily sliding across the room. Is less than BR, is greater than. Is less than BR, is greater than. Then the groaning started again. A terrifying, deep tissue shudder that you could feel in your teeth. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. The entire massive resort began to tilt. It wasn't just a slight lean. The floor physically angled under their feet. Heavy dining tables, supposedly bolted down, started straining against their metal screws. Pianos rolled violently across stages. And down in the lower corridors where the staff slept, the reality was much darker. Cold, black water was already bursting through the doors, violently swallowing the stairwells. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. The truth was no longer something Francesco could hide. They were not experiencing a blackout. They were sinking. By 10:54 p.m., nearly an hour after the impact, the sheer physical reality of the situation forced Francesco's hand. He finally, reluctantly, gave the order to abandon ship. But honestly, it was far too late. Because the ship was now leaning at a severe 20-degree angle, the evacuation protocols were completely useless. On the port side, the lifeboats were swinging wildly out over open air, miles above the water. On the starboard side, they were pinned flat against the steel hull, impossible to lower. Panic, real, unadulterated human panic, finally broke loose. Guests who had been politely sipping wine in evening gowns an hour earlier were now sliding down rain-slicked teakwood decks, desperately grabbing onto deck chairs and railing posts. The air smelled thick with marine diesel and salt water. Down in the belly of the ship, it was pitch black. The emergency strobes only illuminated the freezing water churning through the carpeted hallways. People were trapped in elevators or lost in the labyrinth of lower deck corridors, banging furiously on locked watertight doors. Now, at this point in any maritime disaster, you expect the captain to be the anchor. You expect him on the bridge, shouting coordinates, guiding his crew, being the absolute last man to step off the sinking vessel. The crew, to their credit, were doing exactly that. Waiters, cooks, and musicians, ordinary people making modest wages, were physically carrying elderly passengers down the tilted stairwells. But the Coast Guard, watching the chaotic radar blips from the mainland, couldn't reach the captain on the ship's radio. They needed Francesco to coordinate the rescue helicopters. They needed him to tell them where the bulk of the passengers were trapped. And this is where the story pivots from a tragic accident into a profoundly disturbing psychological horror. At 11:19 p.m., the Coast Guard finally got Francesco Schettino on a cell phone. They asked him what the situation was on the bridge. Francesco hesitated. The audio from this call is public record, and if you listen to it, you can hear a sickening, hollow silence before he answers. He tells the Coast Guard commander, a man named Gregorio DeFalco, that he's not on the bridge. He's not even on the ship. Francesco Schettino, the captain of a vessel with over 4,000 terrified souls still aboard, was standing safely on a rocky outcropping on the island of Giglio. He had slipped away in the dark, boarded a lifeboat, and abandoned his ship. Later, he would infamously claim to investigators that he had simply tripped and fallen into the lifeboat by accident. Just let that rationalization sit in your mind for a second. Commander DeFalco, realizing what had just happened, erupted. The audio captures his voice echoing with sheer enraged disbelief. He orders Francesco to get back on a rescue ladder, climb back up the rotting carcass of his ship, and do his job. Francesco stammers. He makes excuses. He complains that it's dark. He says there are other rescue boats in the way. And then DeFalco screams the phrase that would be printed on t-shirts and newspapers all over Italy the next morning, "Vada a bordo caso! Get on board, damn it!" But Francesco didn't. He stayed on the rock. He stood there in his dry uniform, listening to the distant, mechanical groans of the 114,000-ton beast he had destroyed and the faint, echoing screams of the people he had left behind in the dark. The emotional aftermath the next morning was surreal. When the sun rose on January 14th, the sleepy, picturesque island of Giglio woke up to an apocalyptic sight. The Costa Concordia was dead in the water, laying completely on its starboard side like a massive harpooned whale, practically resting on the island's front porch. Local residents, ordinary people who had been woken up by the commotion, opened their doors to thousands of shivering, traumatized tourists. They brought out heavy winter coats, blankets, and brewed massive pots of stale coffee in the local church to hand out to people still wearing soaking wet tuxedos and evening gowns. The contrast between the mundane kindness of the islanders and the colossal billion-dollar wreck sitting in their harbor was jarring. But the true horror was slowly washing ashore. 32 people died that night. And the heartbreaking reality? Many of them died in their cabins. They drowned because they had listened to the intercom. They had believed the minor electrical failure lie. They followed the rules, trusted the voice of authority, and went back to their rooms to wait for further instructions that never came. The final haunting realization of the Costa Concordia disaster isn't just about a ship sinking. It's about a fatal collision of ego and reality. The ship's drummer, a guy who was just there to play jazz covers, gave his life jacket to a child and went down with the ship. He acted like a captain. Meanwhile, the actual captain, the man who demanded respect, who deviated from a safe route just to show off his power, couldn't even face the consequences of his own arrogance. He didn't just sink a marvel of modern engineering, he proved that when the lights go out and the water rushes in, The loudest, most confident person in the room is often the first one to run.